At 7:18 a.m., Marion Caldwell stood inside the marble lobby and watched the security scanner hesitate, as if it needed permission to deny her. The light turned red. She tried again, slower this time, holding the badge flat the way she always had. The scanner blinked once, then red again, clean and final. The security guard smiled a fraction of a second too late. "Good morning, Miss Caldwell." His voice sounded trained, not friendly. At 7:19 a.m., Marion Caldwell lowered her badge because the body always asks twice before the mind accepts the truth. Around her, the lobby moved the way expensive places always do. Quiet shoes, controlled voices, no wasted motion. No one looked at her directly. Her phone vibrated. A calendar invite appeared on her screen. No subject. No organizer. Just a location. Conference room 14B. At 7:21 a.m., she didn't react. She stepped away from the turnstiles and sat on the leather bench near the windows, the one reserved for donors who like to arrive early and be seen. She opened her email. The first message was from Human Resources. Short, polite, carefully empty. "Marion, please come upstairs. Someone will escort you." Escort. Like she was a painting being moved between rooms. The second email was from Dylan Rourke, her direct superior. Subject line, "Quick sync," one sentence inside. "Please don't complicate this." At 7:23 a.m., Marion Caldwell looked up at the massive digital display rotating tonight's headline event. The Rothwell Collection, one night only. She had reviewed every Rothwell transaction for the past 7 years. She knew which pieces were real assets, which were reputation buffers, and which existed purely to move money without attracting attention. 3 weeks ago, she had found a pattern inside those deals that didn't belong. Not theft, not fraud. Something quieter. Private guarantees being logged as revenue before the auction hammer ever fell. Losses quietly absorbed, risk silently reassigned. It made the house look unstoppable. It made certain clients look brilliant. And it made the numbers lie, without ever technically breaking the rules. At 7:26 a.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered anyway. "Ms. Caldwell," a calm male voice said, "please remain seated. Someone will be with you shortly." He didn't say security. He didn't say HR. He said someone. At 7:27 a.m., Marion Caldwell felt the internal shift. The exact moment when instinct wanted to run and discipline told it to stay. She had built her career inside controlled pressure. Boardrooms, audits, silent rooms where one decimal could cost millions. She knew how to wait. The security cameras were angled toward the turnstiles. The guard's hands stayed visible. 2 employees walked past her without eye contact. That silence was intentional. At 7:31 a.m., the elevator doors opened. A woman stepped out first. Tall, confident, blazer cut too precisely for coincidence. Her hair was pulled back like she had rehearsed the role. Behind her came Dylan Rourke, already wearing the expression of a man who wanted to be remembered as reasonable. The woman extended her hand. "I'm Bryn Halstead," she said brightly. "I'll be overseeing risk and integrity going forward." Risk and integrity. Marion Caldwell's department, her systems, her oversight, her work. At 7:32 a.m., Marion Caldwell shook her hand anyway. "Congratulations," she said. The word landed heavier than intended. Dylan cleared his throat. "Marion, let's go upstairs." "About what?" she asked. He smiled without warmth. "We've made a decision." At 7:34 a.m., Marion Caldwell stood, straightened her coat, and followed them into the elevator like she was heading to a presentation instead of an ending. Inside, Bryn stared at the floor indicator. Dylan stared at his reflection. At 7:36 a.m., the elevator opened onto the executive floor. Thick carpet, framed founders, silence that smelled like power. Conference room 14B was glass on 3 sides. Inside waited HR and legal. A folder sat centered on the table. A pen rested on top, already uncapped. At 7:37 a.m., Marion Caldwell sat down without being asked. HR smiled first. "We appreciate everything you've contributed to Halstead and Mercer Auctions." The name settled in her chest. Halstead and Mercer. So this wasn't a restructure. It was a reclaiming. At 7:38 a.m., the folder slid toward her. This is a separation agreement. Marion didn't touch it. Legal spoke next, voice smooth, practiced. This action is effective immediately. Why? Marion Caldwell asked. HR paused. There have been concerns. Concerns about what? Dylan leaned forward. Fit. At 7:40 a.m., Marion Caldwell opened the folder. Bullet points, neutral language, accusations designed to sound reasonable and be impossible to challenge in one meeting. Disrupting stakeholder confidence, escalating minor irregularities, creating unnecessary friction, minor irregularities. At 7:41 a.m., her eyes reached the sentence legal cared about most. You confirm that you have returned all company property and retain no confidential information. She looked up. Is that why my badge didn't work? She asked. This is standard procedure, legal replied. At 7:42 a.m., Marion Caldwell nodded. Standard procedure was just cruelty wearing a uniform. I won't be signing this, she said calmly. The room shifted. At 7:43 a.m., Dylan's voice dropped. Marion, don't do this. She looked at him. The man who once said, if Marion signed off, we sleep well. Now he wanted her small. At 7:44 a.m., Marion Caldwell stood. Understood, she said. One word, no resistance, no plea. At 7:45 a.m., she walked out of the glass room. They thought it was over. What they didn't realize was that by removing her, they had created something far more dangerous. A clean timestamp. Because Marion Caldwell didn't work in chaos. She worked in timelines. At 7:50 a.m., she stepped onto the Manhattan sidewalk, cold air cutting cleanly through her lungs. Her phone vibrated. A new email. No name, disposable address. Subject, you were right. One sentence inside. They're using your system tonight. At 7:51 a.m., Marion Caldwell stopped walking. Tonight. Live auction. Sponsors present. Private clients on the line. They locked her out of the building. But they were still standing inside what she had built. At 7:52 a.m., she put the phone away and waited for the crosswalk signal to change. Not because she didn't know what to do, because she did. And she would do it the way she always had. Quietly. Accurately. On time. At 9:06 a.m., Marion Caldwell was already home, shoes still on, laptop open on the dining table she normally never worked from. She didn't open the company VPN. She didn't try to log into anything she wasn't supposed to. That wasn't her style. Instead, she opened her own archive. Every system she ever built, she documented twice. Once for the company, once for herself. Not code, not files, just logic, process, flow. Because systems didn't live in servers. They lived in memory. At 9:11 a.m., Marion Caldwell pulled up a blank notebook and wrote one word at the top of the page, Rothwell. 7 letters, 1 family, 1 sale. She didn't start with the auction catalog. She started with the guarantees. Every high-end auction house pretends guarantees are simple. They aren't. They are promises, quiet ones, made to consignors so the house never looks weak. If the hammer doesn't hit the number, the house absorbs the loss. Public confidence stays intact. The trick is timing. At 9:14 a.m., Marion Caldwell drew a single vertical line down the page. Left side, before hammer. Right side, after hammer. Revenue only belongs on one side of that line. 3 weeks ago, while reviewing quarterly exposure, she noticed something small, a number that arrived too early. At 9:17 a.m., she replayed the moment in her mind. A single Rothwell piece, mid-7 figures, had been logged as secured revenue at 3:34 p.m. The auction hadn't happened until 8 p.m., 5 hours and 26 minutes early. At first, it looked like a clerical error, but Marion didn't believe in accidents that survived reconciliation. At 9:19 a.m., she remembered what made her pause. The approval chain. Normally, a guarantee required 3 signatures. Finance, risk, executive. That day, there were only 2, and the missing one, risk. Her department, her sign-off, which meant someone had bypassed her system using a temporary override. Overrides were rare. Overrides were logged. Overrides left fingerprints. At 9:22 a.m., Marion Caldwell turned the page and wrote, "Override code PCL7 Private Client Liquidity, Level 7. That code didn't exist when she first joined the company. She created it 2 years ago under pressure from the executive floor. A special exception path for strategic clients. The kind of thing that made everyone comfortable until it didn't." At 9:25 a.m., she remembered the meeting where it was approved. Dylan's voice, calm, persuasive. "We just need flexibility." She had pushed back. "What's the audit visibility? We'll restrict access." She had documented it anyway. At 9:27 a.m., Marion Caldwell realized what she hadn't realized back then. The override wasn't just bypassing her. It was using her credibility as cover. Because every time the numbers were reviewed later, they looked compliant. The system backfilled the risk after the hammer fell. No losses shown, no alarms triggered. The house looked flawless. At 9:31 a.m., she opened her personal calendar from 3 weeks ago. There it was. At 3:30 p.m., she had been in a closed-door meeting with legal about an unrelated consignment dispute. She hadn't been available. At 9:33 a.m., Marion leaned back in her chair. That wasn't coincidence. That was choreography. They scheduled around her. At 9:36 a.m., Marion Caldwell opened her Notes app and created a timeline. Not accusations, just facts. At 3:32 p.m., override requested. At 3:34 p.m., revenue logged. At 3:36 p.m., exposure temporarily masked. At 8 p.m., auction hammer falls. At 8:04 p.m., override auto resolves 4 minutes. Enough to look normal, enough to pass casual review, not enough to survive a forensic one. At 9:40 a.m., she stopped writing, because she understood something else now. This wasn't about one sale, this was a model. Rothwell wasn't the exception. Rothwell was the proof of concept. At 9:44 a.m., Marion Caldwell checked her phone. No messages, no calls. That meant the company believed the problem was solved. She had been removed. The risk was gone. At 9:47 a.m., she opened her email and drafted a message to herself. Subject, if they do it again. One line inside. Let them. Because tonight mattered. At 9:52 a.m., Marion Caldwell closed the notebook and placed it carefully in her bag. She didn't need access. She didn't need credentials. She needed timing. And she already had that. Because when people believe you're gone, they repeat themselves. At 11:08 a.m., Marion Caldwell received her first confirmation that the house believed the danger had passed. It wasn't a call. It wasn't an email. It was silence. No legal follow-up. No security reminder. No request to retrieve files. They had done what companies always do when they think they've neutralized a variable. They moved on. At 11:14 a.m., Marion Caldwell opened her laptop again, not to access anything, but to listen. She followed the public signals. Press releases, auction previews, social posts tagged by donors who like to be seen early. Everything was normal, which meant everything was proceeding exactly as planned. At 11:21 a.m., she noticed something small on the auction house's public microsite. A line added under the Rothwell sale description. Guaranteed lots secured by private liquidity partners. That sentence hadn't been there yesterday. At 11:24 a.m., Marion Caldwell smiled once, very briefly. They were confident. When executives feel safe, they leave fingerprints everywhere. At 11:37 a.m., her phone vibrated. A text message from a number she didn't recognize. No greeting, just a screenshot. An internal approval interface. Blacked out names, blacked out amounts. Except one detail hadn't been blurred. Override. Type PCL7. Status, scheduled at 6:45 p.m. tonight. At 11:39 a.m., Marion Caldwell didn't reply. She didn't ask questions. She didn't warn anyone. Because traps don't work if you interfere with them. At 11:46 a.m., she wrote a single sentence in her notebook. They're doing it again. Underneath, she added, and this time they want cover. At 11:53 a.m., Marion replayed her exit meeting in her head. Not emotionally, but structurally. What they accused her of. What they documented. What they needed her to sign. One line stood out now more clearly than it had that morning. Creating unnecessary escalation. They weren't just removing her. They were preemptively reframing her. If something went wrong, they wanted her name nearby, but not present. At 12:07 p.m., Marion Caldwell remembered something most people forgot. Automation inherits authority. If you embed a name inside a rule, that name becomes the face of the decision, even if the person never touches it. At 12:12 p.m., she opened her notes and sketched the approval logic from memory. PCL 7 required 3 conditions to auto-execute. 1. Client classified as Strategic Tier A, 2. Executive-level verbal confirmation, Log 3. Risk acknowledgement flag, set to Deferred, deferred. Not approved, not denied, deferred. At 12:18 p.m., Marion exhaled slowly. She had designed that word. Deferred meant temporarily assumed safe. A compromise she never liked. A compromise she now recognized as a doorway. At 12:24 p.m., she wrote another line. If they defer risk again, the system will tag the last active risk officer. Last active. Which meant? At 12:25 p.m., Marion Caldwell stopped writing. She didn't need to finish the sentence. They weren't just using her system. They were using her absence. At 12:31 p.m., her phone vibrated again. Another message. No text, just a calendar screenshot. Approval log auto stamp. Risk oversight. Caldwell M. Timestamp 6:45 p.m. She stared at it for a long time, not in fear, in recognition. At 12:36 p.m., Marion Caldwell set her phone down and leaned back in her chair. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. If the guarantee collapsed later, if the numbers didn't hold, if a regulator ever asked questions, her name would be in the system, not as the decision maker, as the silence. At 12:41 p.m., Marion closed her notebook. She had a choice now. Intervene. Or let the system tell the truth. At 12:45 p.m., she chose the harder option. She chose accuracy. Because accuracy doesn't argue. It records. At 12:52 p.m., Marion Caldwell sent one email. Not to the company, not to legal. To a private address she had never used before. Subject. For your records. Inside, she attached one document. A neutral timeline. No accusations, no commentary, just timestamps. At 12:54 p.m., she scheduled it to send automatically. Delivery time, 7:02 p.m., 17 minutes after the override would execute. At 1 p.m., Marion Caldwell closed her laptop. The trap was set. Not because she had built something new, but because she had allowed the system to finish what it was already doing. And tonight, in front of donors, sponsors, and people who believed art could never betray them, the numbers would speak. At 6:18 p.m., Marion Caldwell sat alone in her apartment with the lights off. The city reflected faintly in the dark glass of her window. She wasn't watching the live stream. She didn't need to. The auction didn't matter. The system did. At 6:29 p.m., her phone buzzed once. A public notification. Halstead and Mercer, tonight's featured sale begins shortly. She placed the phone face down. Silence was easier to maintain when you refused to narrate it. At 6:41 p.m. across Manhattan, guests were arriving in tailored coats and quiet confidence. Champagne moved through the room. Cameras adjusted. Smiles found their places. No one talked about risk. They never did. At 6:45 p.m., Marion Caldwell checked the time anyway. Not because she doubted it, because this was the moment. Somewhere inside the auction house, a workflow executed without emotion. No button pressed, no approval spoken aloud, just logic resolving itself. At 6:46 p.m., the override completed. PCL 7. Deferred risk. Auto-stamped. Attribution assigned. At 6:47 p.m., a line of metadata locked into place. Risk oversight. Caldwell M. At 6:48 p.m., Marion Caldwell exhaled slowly. It was done. At 6:52 p.m., the live stream began. A wide shot of the room. Applause. Polished voices. The auctioneer welcomed the audience, thanking the Rothwell family for their continued trust. Trust was always the word they chose. At 7:02 p.m., Marion's scheduled email sent itself. She didn't watch it leave. She already knew where it was going. A private inbox. A neutral recipient. Someone who understood what timestamps meant when they appeared uninvited. At 7:05 p.m., the first lot sold cleanly. No reaction. At 7:12 p.m., the second lot followed. Applause again. At 7:18 p.m., Marion stood and poured herself a glass of water, hands steady, because anticipation was a luxury she didn't indulge. At 7:26 p.m., somewhere inside the auction house, someone noticed a delay. Not on the floor, in the back end. A reconciliation process hesitated, just long enough to be noticed by someone trained to notice such things. At 7:31 p.m., a quiet message moved through an internal channel. Is anyone seeing a timing mismatch on Rothwell guarantees? No response yet. At 7:38 p.m., Marion Caldwell checked her phone. Nothing. Good. Silence meant confusion. Confusion meant people were checking without wanting to alert anyone else. At 7:44 p.m., the auctioneer introduced the highlighted piece. A Rothwell centerpiece. 7 figures. Phones lifted discreetly. The hammer hovered. At 7:50 p.m., Marion sat back down. This was the moment the system was designed to hide. At 7:55 p.m., the hammer fell. Applause broke out. Champagne glasses lifted. At 7:56 p.m., the override auto-resolved. Exactly 4 minutes later. Clean. Perfect. Too perfect. At 7:58 p.m., an internal alert appeared. Low priority, easily dismissed. Revenue recognition timing discrepancy detected. It had been triggered by a rule Marion herself had written years ago. A rule no one ever thought would matter. At 8:03 p.m., someone in finance replied to the earlier message. Looks normal. Probably latency. Latency. The favorite excuse of people who don't want to look deeper. At 8:11 p.m., Marion's phone vibrated again. One message. Unknown sender. They're asking questions now. At 8:15 p.m., the live stream cut to a wide applause shot as the auctioneer thanked the sponsors. Off camera, people were no longer smiling. At 8:21 p.m., legal joined an internal call. At 8:24 p.m., finance joined. At 8:26 p.m., risk joined. Except risk didn't have a head anymore. At 8:29 p.m., someone said her name, not aloud, in a subject line. At 8:31 p.m., Marion Caldwell finally turned on the live stream. Not to watch the auction. To watch the room. She didn't look for faces. She looked for posture. People leaning in. People whispering. People checking phones they pretended not to care about. At 8:36 p.m., the auctioneer paused longer than necessary between lots. A silence stretched. Not dramatic. Administrative. The kind of silence that only professionals notice. At 8:42 p.m., Marion Caldwell muted the stream. She didn't need more confirmation. The system had done what systems always do when left alone. It told the truth slowly. At 8:47 p.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it ring. At 8:49 p.m., it rang again. She declined it. At 8:52 p.m., a voicemail arrived. She didn't listen. At 8:55 p.m., Marion Caldwell placed her phone face down again. Because the silence was no longer hers. It belonged to them. At 9:03 p.m., Marion Caldwell finally listened to the voicemail. She didn't rewind it. She didn't replay it. She only needed the tone. Urgent, controlled, afraid of being recorded. At 9:06 p.m., her phone rang again. Same number. This time she answered. Marion, Dylan's voice said, trying to sound steady, we need to talk. At 9:07 p.m., Marion Caldwell didn't respond right away. Silence forces people to fill it with truth. There are questions, Dylan continued, about tonight. I assumed there would be, Marion said calmly. At 9:09 p.m., Dylan exhaled. Your name came up in the approval trail. Marion let that sit. Did it, she asked, or was it placed there? At 9:11 p.m., the line went quiet. At 9:13 p.m., a second voice joined the call. Legal. Marion, the voice said carefully, we're just trying to understand the sequence. Then start with the timestamps, Marion Caldwell replied. They're very clear. At 9:16 p.m., someone else joined. Finance. No one introduced themselves. They didn't need to. At 9:18 p.m., Marion spoke again. I was removed from my role at 7:45 a.m. today, she said, correct? No one disputed it. At 6:45 p.m., she continued, an override executed under PCL 7, a deferred risk pathway I designed but did not authorize tonight. She paused. That pathway auto-attributes to the last active risk officer. At 9:21 p.m., legal said nothing. At 9:22 p.m., Marion added the part they couldn't escape. The last active risk officer was me, because you removed the department head without decommissioning the system. At 9:24 p.m., Dylan tried to interrupt. Marion, this is exactly what it is, she said evenly. At 9:26 p.m., Marion Caldwell lowered her voice. I sent a timeline to an independent compliance archive at 7:02 p.m. It contains nothing but facts, no opinions, no conclusions. Another pause. At 7:56 p.m., she continued, the override auto-resolved 4 minutes after the hammer fell. That timing matches 3 prior Rothwell transactions. Silence. Not confusion. Recognition. At 9:29 p.m., Finance spoke. Are you saying this is systemic? Marion didn't answer the question. She reframed it. I'm saying it's repeatable. At 9:31 p.m., someone muted themselves. At 9:33 p.m., Dylan's voice sounded smaller. What do you want? Marion almost smiled. Almost. At 9:35 p.m., Marion Caldwell said, I want nothing. That confused them more than any demand would have. I no longer work for you, she continued. You made that decision very clearly this morning. At 9:38 p.m., legal asked carefully, Then why are you on this call? Marion answered without hesitation. Because the system still speaks in my name. At 9:41 p.m., she delivered the pivot. If you believe I approved tonight's override, she said, you will need to explain why I was terminated 12 hours earlier. If you believe I didn't, she added, you will need to explain why my controls were bypassed. She let the logic finish itself. At 9:44 p.m., no one spoke. At 9:47 p.m., Marion concluded. You don't have a Marion problem, she said. You have a timeline problem. At 9:49 p.m., she ended the call. No threats, no demands, no follow-up. At 9:52 p.m., she placed her phone on the table and walked to the window. Below her, the city moved on, unaware. At 10:03 p.m., her email refreshed. One new message. From legal. Subject, clarification. Inside, one sentence. Would you be willing to consult temporarily while we review internal controls? At 10:05 p.m., Marion Caldwell closed the laptop. Not tonight. At 10:11 p.m., she poured out the rest of the water in her glass and rinsed it clean. At 10:18 p.m., she sat down and opened a new document. Title, Independent Review, Marion Caldwell. At 10:22 p.m., she began to write. Not as their employee, not as their shield, as a record. Because quiet revenge doesn't look like victory. It looks like inevitability. At 8:12 a.m. the following morning, Marion Caldwell woke before her alarm. Not because she was anxious, because her body no longer needed to brace. At 8:19 a.m., she made coffee and opened her laptop, sunlight cutting across the table where the notebook still lay closed. She didn't open it yet. At 8:27 a.m., the first headline appeared. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just careful. Halstead and Mercer reviews internal risk controls after auction timing discrepancy. Timing discrepancy. That was the language of people buying time. At 8:34 a.m., a second article followed. This one unnamed. Sources indicate questions around private guarantee recognition practices. Questions, plural. At 8:41 a.m., Marion Caldwell checked her email. 3 new messages. All from different firms. All using the same tone. Respectful. Curious. Precise. None mentioned last night. They didn't have to. At 8:53 a.m., a 4th message arrived. From a board liaison at Halstead and Mercer. Subject, Process inquiry. Inside, one line. The board would appreciate clarity on historical PCL7 usage. Marion closed the email without responding. Clarity was not something you rushed. At 9:07 a.m., she finally opened her notebook. The timeline hadn't changed. That was the point. At 9:18 a.m., Marion Caldwell noticed something else. Silence from Dylan. No apology, no explanation, no request. Which meant legal had told him not to speak. At 9:32 a.m., a fifth email arrived, this one shorter. Would you be willing to submit an independent review proposal? No company logo, no assumptions. At 9:35 a.m., Marion Caldwell began to write her reply. Not immediately. She let the cursor blink. At 9:41 a.m., she typed one sentence. I am willing to review documented processes and timelines. Nothing more. At 9:46 a.m., she sent it. At 10:02 a.m., the response came back. Understood. That was when she knew. They weren't looking for forgiveness. They were looking for insulation. At 10:14 a.m., another headline surfaced. A quiet one. Rothwell family requests clarification on guarantee structure. Requests, not accusations, yet. At 10:26 a.m., Marion Caldwell closed her laptop and stepped outside. The city looked the same. That was always the strange part. At 11:03 a.m., her phone rang, a number she recognized now, legal. She let it ring once, then answered. Marion, the voice said, controlled but thin. We'd like to formalize your role. At what capacity? She asked. Independent reviewer. Marion smiled, just enough for herself. At 11:07 a.m., she replied, I'll send terms. At 11:19 a.m., she drafted them. Short, clear, hourly, limited scope, full independence, written record only, no meetings without agendas, no edits to findings, no attribution without context. At 11:32 a.m., she sent the document. At 11:49 a.m., it was accepted. No negotiation. At 12:06 p.m., Marion Caldwell stood by her window again. Below, the same people hurried to the same places, unaware that something had shifted quietly above them. At 12:18 p.m., she opened a new file. Title: Observations, Preliminary. She didn't call it a report. Reports suggested conclusions. Observations suggested inevitability. At 12:34 p.m., she wrote the first line. PCL7 usage demonstrates a repeatable pattern of early revenue recognition. At 12:41 p.m., she paused, then added, Risk attribution during executive transition periods requires explicit governance. No names, no blame, just structure. At 12:57 p.m., Marion Caldwell saved the file. At 1:04 p.m., she closed the laptop. At 1:12 p.m., she poured herself another coffee. This one tasted different. Not sweeter, clearer. At 1:28 p.m., her phone buzzed with a final notification. Halstead and Mercer postpones upcoming private sales pending review. Postpones, not cancels. Yet. At 1:35 p.m., Marion Caldwell sat down, calm, composed, and unbothered. They had taken her badge, they had taken her office, they had taken her title, but they had left her the one thing that mattered, the record. And records don't argue. They wait. Lessons learned. Lesson 1. Power doesn't fear rebellion. It fears accurate records. Lesson 2. When a company removes a person without shutting down their system, the system will eventually speak louder than the person ever could. Lesson 3. Most corporate scandals don't begin with crimes. They begin with convenient exceptions. Lesson 4. Automation doesn't make decisions. It inherits accountability. Lesson 5. If your name appears in an approval trail, timing matters more than intention. Lesson 6. Being calm isn't weakness. It's how you keep the timeline clean. Lesson 7. When they ask what you want, it means they've already lost control. Lesson 8. Quiet revenge isn't about exposure. It's about letting the truth arrive on schedule. Lesson 9. Titles can be taken. Access can be revoked. But records, once created, cannot be argued with. Final thought. In corporate life, the most dangerous person isn't the one who fights back. It's the one who documents everything and waits.